Hi guys, we're going to get started in a few minutes. Just wanted to let you in. I know some of you have been waiting there for about 10 minutes. Nice to see you. And just a note to those that are here, we are recording this and it is going to be streamed to Facebook. So in case at the end you have questions, if you don't feel comfortable asking out loud, you can always type the question into the chat directly to me or to Jen, and we can ask the question for you. So you can stay anonymous if you prefer. I actually turned off the Facebook stream because when I checked, it was allowing other people to pop up. So I'm not going to stream it to Facebook. I don't feel comfortable doing that if other people are going to pop up without knowing.
Yeah, you can record and post.
Yeah, I'm going to record and share it with those that signed up. And yeah, exactly. Okay, so as people are coming in, I'm going to just start. I like to start on time and end on time to respect everybody's time and showing up here. So for those that are new, I do see some new faces and new names. Welcome to A Call to Heal Buffalo. Many of you know why this was launched, so I won't go too far into it, but with all the recent suicides and mental health challenges going on and addictions, it really felt like it was a time to heal, and that these conversations that have been pretty avoided over many decades, it's time to bring them to the surface and really talk about these things that people are struggling with and what we can do about it. So I like to address the problems, but I also like to bring in different guests and experts to share about a variety of different solutions and practices and ways of being and different perspectives, so that you can explore whatever resonates with you and what works for you to go deeper. So I'll bring in many different guests, as some people have seen, and I feel it's really important that you always use your own curiosity, discernments, and you take what resonates and then you leave what doesn't. That's a big part of the healing journey, that not everything, that people say is going to resonate for you, but if it does provoke something in you, I also invite you to explore that and see why maybe that provokes. Sometimes it's something we really need to look at, and sometimes it just doesn't land well and it doesn't feel authentic for us. So always use your own discernment on these. With the recent, let's see, sorry. So as you know, when people think about healing, a lot of times they think about it as something really obvious that you need to heal. But what I found in this journey is that there's a lot of different parts of ourselves that have kind of gotten fragmented over years, whether it's from people's judgments, it's from society, it's from systems, it's from losses. And so healing really is something that we all, I think, need to do into our lives. And there's always an opportunity for some area of healing. It can, for me, you know, mine is around patience. It could be a reactivity. You know, that's definitely my life's work, and constantly looking at it and understanding why I do the things I do or why I say the things I say. And I hope that this can be a space for all of you, you know, to ask yourself these questions and face some of these parts of yourself that you would like to work on and improve. My hope that this can just be one small piece of a place to learn, grow, and educate ourselves. I'm always curious about spaces that are not centered around a lot of these addictions that we hold around alcohol or drugs, but also to learn to share and be vulnerable and express ourselves in ways that maybe we haven't learned how to do before and could be something new for us. And to be in community in a healthy way where it doesn't involve judgment or gossip or you know, any other unhealthy patterns that we've picked up. So I'll continue to bring guests and topics that I feel most of us prefer to avoid, but feel really important if we're going to move forward into a sense of healing. So with that, tonight we're joined by Jen Bruce. I'm super excited for Jen to join us. I met Jen in the coaching program, Being True to You, that I did. It was an 8-part workshop, so it was a lot more than what we're going into today, but I was really blown away by Jen's story, her passion, her expertise, her wisdom, and everything she's learned over a decade in this area around mental health and addictions and trauma. And she's going to share just a snippet of that with us tonight. And I hope that, you know, everybody can take something away from it that maybe they didn't know before. Jen is a functional medicine practitioner, a life coach, and an educator. And she chose the topic of breaking the Irish curse. And when she sent me that email, I said, oh, that's going to be very provoking. And I really like it. I feel that's really what a call to heal is about, is kind of taking the elephant in the room and just placing it right in front of everybody and saying, like, let's talk about this. Let's bring in different perspectives and people that can share about these experiences and help us learn about them more. So thanks for choosing the topic, Jen. It was very relevant. And a funny thing is that Jen is actually, her partner is connected to Buffalo. So I thought, you know, when I felt that she was the right person to bring in and talk about this relationship with alcohol in the community, it was just a funny coincidence that her partner is also from Buffalo. And she's not only from an Irish family, but, you know, her partner being there, I thought it was a very interesting link to have. So with that, I'm going to say, Jen, welcome. She's going to be talking about the interplay between ancestral trauma and how this shows up in genetic tendencies towards mental health, addiction, and chronic health issues. And she's also going to share her own experience and story through that journey. So I'm going to welcome you, Jen.
Thank you, Megan. And thank you for having me here. It's so important and so wonderful what you're doing. And it always starts out with just a couple of people, but the ripple effect is amazing. And I've seen that in my own family, in my own life. But yeah, so my name is Jen Bruce, Jennifer Lauren Bruce. I'm half Irish and half Norwegian, third generation United States. My Irish family settled in the Midwest and South Dakota as farmers and worked on the railroads. And they had a pretty hard life out there too. I'm out in Northern California. I grew up in Eugene, Oregon. My granddad, Lawrence Madden, 100% Irish, was in the military, World War II, and eventually became a commander in the Navy. And so why I'm here tonight is because of my own experience and my own healing journey. And, that's the only reason I really know anything about this topic. And it's the only reason I really have any qualification to speak to it at all. I do have about 7 years of functional medicine training behind me. I've worked in the addiction field for 12 years now. And I'm a person in long-term recovery from severe alcohol addiction, 17 years of it. And I had multiple diagnoses during that time in my early recovery. I'm in my 12th year of recovery now, alcohol and drug-free. And at the beginning of my journey too, I had diagnosed with depression, anxiety. I think they'd slipped in PTSD, bipolar disorder, all kinds of things. And then I had fibromyalgia and all kinds of chronic immune-related health conditions that they really couldn't figure out why. And I chose to not go the Western medical route because I was seeing a devastating relatives, family members, and friends of mine, and I chose to go on the healing path instead. I can tell you today, at 42 years old, my life is better than it's ever been. I feel better than I did now than I did at 22 years old. I'm symptom-free, I'm diagnosis-free, and I'm medication-free, and I'm free. I can take or leave alcohol. I keep alcohol in my house for when my friends that drink come over. It does not bother me at all. I don't want it anymore, and it's no longer, it's like a non-issue. And my 9-year-old daughter has never seen me take a drink. And she knows that I don't drink because I'm allergic to alcohol. And she also knows that a lot of people in our family are allergic to alcohol. So she already knows at 9 years old, what alcoholism looks like. And the reason that I dove more deeply into the work that I do in my own healing journey, because I was 3 years sober when my daughter was born, and I was very active in 12-step community and AA, which saved my life. But I had a lot of friends that were my age, and I noticed that most of them had grown up in a 12-step home with sober parents. And so what that made me realize was that something was missing, because that wasn't enough to prevent this from getting passed on to their children. And after the absolute hell that alcohol eventually brought me to, and the tremendous fear that I had around the mental health issues that I thought just ran in my family that were genetic. On my Irish side, there was a lot of mental health issues. There was autism, there was schizophrenia, there was, my mother was clinically depressed most of her life. And so I was terrified that by having my daughter, that I was raising her up to have this outcome as well. And so, after I got my foundation in recovery from alcohol use disorder, I ended up getting into yoga, and that helped me so much that I ended up going. I've been to India 5 times. I have multiple certifications in Indian yoga and meditation. I had chronic health conditions that the Western medical system is not designed to diagnose or treat. And I refused to look at a life of pain management on opiates with my little girl in tow. And I saw some people I knew healing. And so eventually my healing took me to functional medicine, which I'll explain tonight, the power of using nutrition, the power of mindset, and eventually even into the world of therapeutic applications of psychedelic medicines. And that was actually what really changed everything for me. And as I went along my journey, and as I continue to go along my healing journey, what I've come to realize is that the most important part of my healing journey, and the most important part of the healing journey for my family members and for the people that I work with, is that we understand what we're actually dealing with. I grew up in a home, probably much like some of your own, where there was a lot of stigma around these topics, where we didn't talk about these things. We essentially didn't talk about anything that was wrong or that needed to be addressed due to fear, due to lack of skills to handle uncomfortable emotions. And underneath it all, it was just a complete misunderstanding of what we were all dealing with. And so as I've gone down the line and worked through the different layers of my issues, what I've realized for myself and for the entire Irish community and for my entire family lineage and for all of the communities of people in the world that have been displaced, that have been abused, that have been traumatized, that have been tortured, all of the indigenous peoples of the world pretty much that have been colonized are suffering from what's called generational trauma. And what generational trauma is when a society of people, of community of people go through something terrible like a war or a famine or oppression in different shapes and forms, is that this puts us into a state of survival. And until that's healed, it gets transferred from one generation to the next. And what this looks like is it shows up as pain. It shows up as the inability to connect with other people. It ends up showing up in depression, in anxiety, and we'll get into a little bit later in the talk today, but it actually, that stress is what negatively impacts the genes to express themselves. And what I've learned and what I'm living proof of is that our genetics have 30,000 to the 30,000th power to express themselves in different ways, which is almost infinite. And stress is what impacts our genes to manifest in negative ways, right? So genes are not our destiny. They're our tendency when we're under stress. And until the collective trauma of a community has been healed, starting with one family down to the next generation, with one parent, with one person in the family healing themselves, then we can start to heal the consecutive generations, not only that are to come ahead of us, but the ones behind us too. And I can tell you from personal experience, I watch it in real time. I just had a birthday for my 9-year-old daughter. My mother was here, and we're all healing together. So it just takes one person to start this to ripple throughout an entire community and then to heal. And the first thing to do is understand what we're dealing with and then to start talking about it. So I have a couple videos to show you that are really short to kind of explain, but I think as people from the Irish community, it's really important to understand what our people went through, why we fled Ireland and are essentially refugees in the United States, and we were not well received here either. And if you aren't Irish, this information can translate to whatever your heritage might be. So with that being said, I'm going to pull up a video to watch. And this is a short video.
This is a story about Ireland, and it's a story about an event that you've probably heard of, but might not know much about. It's usually called the Irish Potato Famine. In most history books, the Irish Potato Famine doesn't get a lot of attention. At most, it appears as a pretty simple story to explain Irish migration abroad. In the beginning, Irish people depended on the potato for food. Then there was a potato disease. Many Irish died, and others migrated abroad on what they called coffin ships to England, Scotland, Australia, and North America. But the story of the famine is a lot more complicated and a lot more disturbing than that. It was much less natural and much more artificial than you might think. And it all goes back to a man named Thomas Malthus. Malthus was a British economist. And in 1798, Malthus put forward an influential idea and a rather counterintuitive one. Malthus said that when food production increased, people were better off for a little. But that improvement led to an increase in population, which eventually caused societal problems. There were too many people and not enough food to go around. Poverty and famine were the natural results. Like animals, Malthus said, humans had a certain carrying capacity. When it exceeded that carrying capacity, enough people would die to return the population to a natural equilibrium. So in the 19th century, that so-called Malthusian model became the conventional wisdom in European intellectuals. It led them to focus on what they called overpopulation and made them think of famine as nature reducing population to a sustainable level. No serious economist today will tell you that having too many people is the reason people are poor or hungry. In 1981, the economist Amartya Sen explained the real cause of most historical famines. If you look at the historical record, Sen said, a collective lack of food is never the real problem. The cause of famines, while it often has something to do with a decline in agricultural production, is more related to the unequal distribution of food. There's enough food for everyone, but some people can't exchange what they have for that food. Sen found that famine is usually not the result of too little food, but of exploitation and unequal economic relations. Irish people were the other, against whom the British could define themselves. They were viewed as lazy, barbaric, barely human. Ireland itself was run as a colony for the emerging class of British capitalists. While England was rapidly becoming the wealthiest country in the world, Ireland was kept incredibly poor. The population was almost entirely composed of peasants. A large majority of all houses were huts made of mud. And the land those peasants lived on was owned almost entirely by absentee English landlords who never visited Ireland and extracted exorbitant amounts in rent. Even the British government regarded these landlords with disdain, calling them, quote, the most oppressive species of tyrant that has ever lent assistance to the destruction of a country. So most Irish people were on a treadmill of extreme poverty. They were the most destitute people in all of Europe. In many districts, one government report found, their only food is the potato, their only beverage, water, a bed or a blanket is a rare luxury. And that part about the potato is especially important. Ireland has a lot of fertile soil and a topography that is ideal for grazing cattle. But when the British came in and colonized Ireland, they systematically took that land and used it to produce beef for the domestic English market. And so the economically poor Irish turned to the potato, a versatile crop that could be grown in large numbers on bad soil. And while the potato was adaptable, it was also really unreliable. There had been widespread potato failures pretty much every other year in the 19th century. And in the 1840s, a new potato disease, originally from North America, arrived in Europe. Huge potato crop failures sprung up in northern France, in Belgium, and in the Netherlands. But none of those places were as dependent on the potato as a source of food as was Ireland. So when the disease got to Ireland in the 1840s, the results were devastating. In 1845, about a third of the Irish crop was destroyed. By 1846, 75% of it was gone. Hunger spread rapidly with unprecedented severity. This period became known in Ireland as An Drachia, the bad life. But as Amartya Sen observed, this wasn't just about a pure lack of food. In fact, during the entire period of the famine, Ireland was continuing to export food out of the country. Enough cows, sheep, pigs, and grain were being shipped out of Ireland that could feed the Irish population twice over. But the British government refused to do anything about it. Soon, the Irish began begging their British overlords for relief. And early on, the Conservative Party government, then the representatives of the old British aristocracy, had a fairly sympathetic response. They bought food from America and brought it to Ireland, distributing it to the poor. But in 1846, a different party, the Whigs, came to power in Britain. And the Whigs did not have the sort of aristocratic paternalism that the Conservatives had. They were advocates of a philosophy called laissez-faire, the idea that the free market, left alone, would solve virtually any problem. So the person they put in charge of famine relief in Ireland was a man named Charles Trevelyan. Trevelyan had been a colonial administrator in India, and he was a big believer in those Malthusian ideas about population. He didn't really want to stop the starvation. He thought it was, well, necessary. The famine, Trevelyan said, was, quote, an effective mechanism for reducing surplus population. He said, it was the judgment of God that sent the famine to teach the Irish a lesson. The real evil, he said, is not the physical evil of the famine, but the moral evil of the selfish, perverse, and turbulent character of the Irish people. So Trevelyan's solution to the famine was to let it ride. The laissez-faire Whigs decided to change nothing. They refused to stop the movement of food to England and limited the amount of food they offered to the starving Irish people. The food that was being imported into Ireland was largely used not to feed the Irish, but to feed the cattle being slaughtered for British consumption. Even when they did offer some relief to the Irish peasants, they instituted moralistic tests, requiring that recipients live as indentured servants in a workhouse to improve their work ethic. The British even required that food only go to people who owned almost no land, forcing impoverished farmers to sell all the remaining land they had to their landlords, many of whom lived in Britain. And so the famine only got worse. Diseases of hunger like typhus, dysentery, and cholera spread wildly, killing just as many people as the lack of food. Social structures broke down. Ordinary people turned en masse to begging, crime, prostitution. In Western Ireland, some resorted to cannibalism. The British, fearing a rebellion, sent army troops instead of food. As the news of the famine spread all over the world, shiploads of food finally began arriving. Americans from all strata generously sent money and food over the Atlantic, only to have their donations met with huge British cargo fees upon arrival. Even the Choctaw people donated to the famine relief funds, just a few years after they had experienced starvation themselves on the Trail of Tears. It was a beautiful example of international solidarity. But these donations weren't enough to stop the ruthless exploitation by British landlords. Even when enough food was being imported, it wasn't getting to the Irish people. Starvation and death continued. Impoverished Irish, with barely enough to eat, were evicted from their homes. One priest remembers the scene of a mass eviction. 700 human beings were driven from their homes in one day and sent adrift on the world to gratify the caprice of one who before God and man probably deserved less consideration than the last and the least of them. The horrid scenes I had then witnessed, I must remember all my life long. The wailing of women, the screams, the terror, the consternation of children, the speechless agony of honest, industrious men, wrung tears of grief from all who saw them. By the time the famine began to end in the early 1850s, about 20% of the Irish population, 2 million human beings, had died of disease or hunger. Another 2 million had left for brighter shores. Today, Ireland's population is still lower than it was in the 1840s. But Ireland has never forgotten the famine and the generosity that some showed to them. During COVID, when the people of the Navajo Nation were hit hard, Ireland repaid their kindness shown to them during the famine by raising $2 million. And Ireland has never forgotten those who did not help them, the British government, and all those who valued profits over humanity. As the British historian A.J.P. Taylor would later write, the English governing class had the blood of 2 million Irish people on their hands. All Ireland was a Belsen. I'm Rory Duffy, professor of history and filmmaker for the Gravel Institute.
Okay, so that may seem a little strange why I would show you that on the topic of functional medicine, mental health, and addiction. But it's really important. And so what I'm going to back up and explain to you, if you haven't heard of what functional medicine is, that's okay. It's a newly emerging approach to healthcare in response to the fact that over the last 80 years or so, the Western population has gone from acute life-threatening illnesses to chronic illness. And the Western medicine model that we now have, that's called allopathic medicine, that you go see your primary care physician, that your insurance covers, does not only not diagnose, but it does not treat chronic health conditions. And these are lifestyle conditions that we can clearly see with this condition like diabetes that's on the rise, and obesity related issues, at least here in the United States and other Western cultures that are on the standard Western diet and the standard Western lifestyle. And so when we look back to the history of Ireland and the people that would have left Ireland and settled in the United States, and again, if you're not Irish, this is a good exercise for you to understand how to look into your own family history and where did my people come from if you're struggling with some of tonight's topics or some of your loved ones are. And so functional medicine is a biology-based, scientific-based approach to health and wellness, where we look at the systems of the human body and recognize the fact that they all work together, and that things like diet, like lifestyle, like stress, like exposure to toxins, like a history of trauma in this lifetime or beyond, mindset, all exercise, all of these things have an impact on either keeping us healthy and well or keeping us sick and stuck. And the functional medicine movement is growing exponentially now. There's many functional medicine practitioners out there. It's just a holistic approach, but it's also science-based. So in my practice, I may bring in, nutrition or some ancient modalities, but then we're also looking at lab tests and genetics and all kinds of things. And then the main difference between allopathic Western medicine, that's the current main model right now, and functional medicine is that Western medicine is looking at the symptoms and treating the symptoms, whereas functional medicine is getting to the root of the issue and healing it at the root. So that way we get rid of the symptoms. So rather than blowing away the smoke, which are the symptoms, we put the problem out. We put the fire out the root, right? And so when we can look back and see that most recent history of Ireland, it goes back to 795 AD when the Vikings originally came in and conquered Ireland, and Ireland was historically warring for hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years. It's been war torn, and this was the final big thing when the defeat really happened. But the people were disfranchised from their land, their belief system was taken away from them. Originally they were Celtic and Druid, and it was a very rich spiritual community of people, and healthy. You can tell by the landmarks that are in Ireland, like Stonehenge. Like, that's a sign of an advanced culture who was not struggling with mental health issues. They were not struggling with disease. They were not struggling with alcohol use disorder. People that build monuments like that are doing very, very well. So that's where we started from. That's where we ended. And I think it's really important to highlight, because in the history books, so right now there's a thing called decolonization that's going on, and it's to unlearn the lies that the colonization movement across the different demographics in the world were told in order to justify the incredible tortures and disastrous things that were done to overtake these people's lands were told. And became belief and became the printed history books, right? And so I grew up thinking that the potato famine was just a thing, like the potatoes got sick, Irish people ate potatoes, and we had to leave because there wasn't any food. But in actuality, there was plenty of food. The same man that was in charge of affairs in India, and I've been there 5 times, and it's some of the greatest human suffering I've ever seen. They were a wealthy, rich country at one point, gold and gems and spices and tradition and monuments and unbelievable human civilization, and colonization is the reason that the suffering that happens in India is there today. It's because of colonization. Same person was in charge of doing the things in Ireland. There was, they were turned into indentured servants. That's another name for basically slave. And then they were characterized as less than human and bad people. I mean, when you're a very Christian person and you're told that this plight has come upon you because of God is judging you because you're a bad person, you can start to see where the stigma comes into our own culture, and we start to forget where that information came from and start to believe it ourselves, and how these ideas could spread. Because I know from the stories from my own family, when we came over to the United States, we were not received well. We were not treated as equal and had to do really terribly hard work in terrible conditions just to survive in the United States. So we can see where these things were planted. In functional medicine, we recognize that food is one of the strongest medicines that human beings need to be healthy. Food literally turns into every raw building material our body needs to keep itself healthy and replete itself from disease. And that is not limited to our mental health, because our mental health is determined by our brain health. And just like if we go on a crash diet and reduce our calories and lose a lot of weight, if we take away the raw nutrients that our body needs to make chemicals like neurotransmitters, which are the chemical messengers of our brain, you may be familiar with serotonin, and it's linked to depression, or dopamine, which is responsible for our sense of reward and joy. And dopamine deficiency is directly linked and implicated in every single case of addiction. And those nutrients come from primarily animal protein. So you can imagine if an entire community of people who are used to hunting and gathering and eating red meat and fish and a multitude of vegetables, and all of a sudden they were putting on potatoes, you might see some mental illness, because the raw building materials needed to create the brain chemicals that keep our brain healthy and then keep our mental health intact are no longer available to us. And then stress is the number one element that causes disease in the human body, including the human brain. So if you combine a lack of nutrients and escalated levels of stress, there would be something wrong with a person if they did not display symptoms, because symptoms are the way that our body tells us that it needs something. And if our symptoms are mental, it's essentially telling us that our brain is lacking something. Right? And when we're under stress, it compromises our digestive system tremendously. And when our digestive system is compromised, these neurotransmitters like serotonin that are responsible for keeping us out of depression primarily, and it's not the only reason that people become depressed, but it's one of the main physical reasons. We can get into debilitating states of mental health challenges. And then the pain that comes from this stress, the pain that comes from this generational trauma, that shows up like anxiety, that shows up like depression, that shows up like inability to connect with other human beings. It shows up as anger outbursts. Trauma, when we're in a lot of stress, we get into fight or flight. They say the Fighting Irish, they mentioned that the Irish have a turbulent character. I remember growing up in my Irish family and getting old enough and starting to hear people's opinions of Irish people. I stopped telling people that I was Irish because I didn't want them to think I was crazy. And, it would be abnormal after what this particular community of people have been through for them not to be in a stress response state, not to go into fight or flight, and not to exhibit characteristics like anger, like quick to fight, like depression, and even all the way up to mental illnesses like bipolar disorder and schizophrenia, which, by the way, for all of those mental health disorders, there's no lab test or criteria to absolutely diagnose with somebody with these clusters of symptoms. So it actually is called an opinion diagnosis, and they're symptoms, but it's not the reason. It's not a lifelong thing, and they can be corrected. And generally speaking, and if these things run in families, there may be a genetic tendency to go this way, but it's stress and malnutrition and toxic exposure that light the fire to keep these things glowing, right? And so when we get into like the suffering states that we're talking about, it's very normal to turn to alcohol, because alcohol takes care of anxiety. It lifts us out of depression. It can ease the pain that sometimes has been carried through our families for infinitum. And so this perpetual down spiral starts to happen. And that's how we look at this through functional medicine, because alcohol sterilizes microbes. And the only medicinal use for alcohol is to sterilize things. They'll use it in doctor's offices and hospitals. So within our gut health, there's about 6 to 7 pounds of bacteria that's healthy when it's in balance. And that bacteria that is supposed to be living in our gut in a particular balance is responsible for manufacturing and absorbing 95% of our serotonin. So if we have all this stress, if we have all this pain, and then we turn to alcohol to temporarily numb it, what we're actually doing is perpetuating the problem infinitum, and we're killing off the microbes in our gut that are responsible for producing the chemicals in our body that keep our mental health stable and keep the cravings for things to numb out our pain at bay. It also hosts us. It diminishes our immune system. 80% of our immune system's in our gut. And so when we're under stress, when we're chronically exposing ourselves to alcohol and other things, it actually diminishes our immune system too. And so just like we saw in the film, the people started succumbing in Ireland to a multitude of different diseases besides the actual starvation. And this is a perfect example of functional medicine, right? It wasn't that these people just are sick people. Their environment became so unhealthy for them that they became sick. It was because they lacked the proper nutrition that they're genetically designed to eat, because it was taken away from them. In functional medicine, we look at the importance of community and the need for human connection, and that was taken away. They were probably hunter-gatherer type people before all of this happened, and that was taken away. So the type of physical activity that they were used to, all of these things, and then all of the stress. And then what happens is we become susceptible to disease. So the only way to build ourselves back from all of this is to rebuild a new lifestyle and a new way of relating to our environment that promotes our wellness rather than our sickness. And so as the generations go along, we begin to believe things like, this is just a genetic thing that runs in my family, or this is just what my community does. Well, it hasn't always been that way. There was something that happened. It's something that broke, and this was the response. And so there's no shame in any of this, right? There's no shame. That this is a totally normal response to what happened. But here's the thing: every generation that this continues to go on, that it's not addressed and it's not healed, it consecutively gets passed down generation and generation, and it gets worse and worse. So it's passed down from generation to generation is not the genetics, it's the environment that's passed down, starting with our mindset into how we live our daily lives, how we handle or don't handle stress. If we decide to look at ourselves and what our partner is, or if we're going to choose to deflect and blame everybody else. That's a big thing in my family, was whose fault was it, was our favorite game to play behind everybody's back. And so all of this stuff gets perpetuated. And so the genetics keep showing up in the same way because the environment's the same. So when we change the environment, when we change how we do things, starting with recognizing why we do things the way we do, then we can change the environment and change the genetic expression. And then these kind of things can start to go away. And I'll tell you what, like with my daughter, I was so terrified of all of this stuff, the alcoholism, the mental health issues, everything getting passed along to her. I'm not worried about her having to deal with this at all anymore, because we've changed the environment. And even if there's still some things there, because it take some generations to heal this as well. And we can see this in science. The traditional healing communities and the traditional spiritual teachings have recognized that 7 generations to heal this for a long time. But we see this in science now with the genetics. But even if my daughter has to face this in her lifetime, like she has tools now, and because I'm the one that has started to break this for my family lineage, the burden on her is less. So I'm not afraid for her at all anymore. And I'm even less afraid for her children. I am going to bring up one more short film on addiction, and then and the relation between alcohol and trauma. And we'll talk a little bit more, and then I'll open it up for people. If you guys have any questions, you can type them into the chat box. And then also, if that's not comfortable for you, you can always reach out to me later too. But I am gonna share one more video. And this particular man, well, he'll tell his story, but Dr. Gabor Mate has been one of my greatest teachers and mentors. He's a leading world expert on trauma and the link between trauma and addiction. And he is prolifically online. So if any of this resonates with you, I would encourage you to check out some more of his talks. He's also got an amazing offering of books that he's published, and he is just an incredible human being with so much knowledge to share. So that's why I bring this here to you tonight.
Was ground zeros for addiction, and that the downtown east side of Vancouver, British Columbia is one of the world's ground zeros for addiction, and that in a few square block radius, we have thousands of people injecting, inhaling, and ingesting drugs of all kinds, and paying dearly for it. These people are often outside the law, certainly beset by many medical problems due to injection drug use, including psychosis, including HIV, including hepatitis C, cancers. They die of overdoses. This is trench warfare, and the people that are the frontline soldiers dying from it are the people affected by addiction. So that's where I worked for 12 years. And what I learned could be summed up very, very briefly by saying that addiction is not a choice that anybody makes. It's not a moral failure. It's not an ethical lapse. It's not a weakness of character. It's not a failure of will. It's just how our society depicts addiction. Nor is it an inherited brain disease, which is how the medical tendency is to see it. What it actually is, it's a response to human suffering. And all these people that I worked with had been severely traumatized as children. All the women had been sexually abused. All the men had been traumatized, some of them sexually, physically, emotionally neglected. And not only is that my perspective, it's also what the scientific and research literature shows. So addiction then is actually, rather than being a disease as such or a human choice, it actually is, it's an attempt to escape suffering temporarily. By the time I went to work there, I had already been in family practice for 20 years. I'd seen a lot, and I was quite attuned to the impact of early childhood experiences on adult psychology and adult brain physiology. But I just hadn't seen the depth and the degree until I went to work down there. So really it dramatized and confirmed for me, made it very palpable how addictions are a response to suffering, and that what people need in response to addiction is not judgment and not simply symptom control. They need to be helped to heal from their trauma, because it is all about trauma. The media, the television, cultural depiction of addicts is usually as desperate people, but without showing why they're desperate. So all that shows is the desperation for the drugs. There's no indication of what's driving that desperation. And hence you see them behaving in all kinds of dysfunctional ways, aggressive or manipulative or unpleasant. But again, there's no three-dimensional sense of the reality of these people as to what that's really all about for them. Is it possible to cure people? You're speaking from the Western model, where I am the expert and you're the one with the disease, and I'm going to cure you. like you cure a piece of meat. No. The answer to that question, framed that way, is no. It's not possible. If you're asking, is it possible for people to heal from trauma sufficiently that they don't have to keep escaping into addictions to lessen the suffering of their trauma? Yes, that's entirely possible. But the question is, under what conditions is that possible? And under the conditions that obtain in London, UK, or Vancouver, British Columbia, or in New York, or any place, under the conditions that obtain socially, legally, and from the perspective of medical practice, it's hardly a likelihood, because we're approaching it from the wrong direction and with the wrong perspective. If I could constantly demonstrate that with this particular population, I could affect a 5 or 10% success rate of getting people to leave their addiction behind, I'd be considered to be a genius, because our results are so poor. When I say ours, I don't mean ours specifically in Vancouver. I don't mean that. I mean the overall treatment model for addiction is so poor in succeeding with the most affected segments of the population. So, I mean, addictions are like everything else on a spectrum. So a lot of people do heal from addictions, but the most inveterate, most entrenched addicts, they have the hardest time. And they're also the ones whom society gives the hardest time, so that it makes it even harder to help them. Never mind, they don't get the help they need, they actually get actively punished. And so what you've actually got is traumatized children. When children are traumatized, that affects how they feel about themselves, which is deeply ashamed, because a child always believes that it's about himself. So if I'm being hurt like this, I gotta be a terrible person. Or if I was sexually abused, why didn't I fight back? I must be a very weak person. So there's a deep sense of shame. Then there's tremendous emotional pain that accrues from abuse and neglect. Tremendous emotional pain that is hardly possible for people to bear. Now they have to soothe their pain with substances or other compulsive behaviors. Then the trauma itself, given that the human brain develops an interaction with the environment, shapes the brain circuitry in such a way that the person will be more likely to find relief from the drugs. So the very physiology of the brain is affected by early trauma. So then you take these traumatized people and you make their habit illegal. It's not illegal to drink yourself to death. It's not illegal to make yourself sick with emphysema or lung cancer by means of cigarettes, but it's illegal to use other substances. So now you take these abused, traumatized people, you place them outside the law, you put them in jails, and you hound them all their lives, treating them like criminals and bad people and failures and rejects and less than human. And then we wonder how come they don't get better. So it's a self-perpetuating cycle of taking traumatized people and then re-traumatizing them, and then hoping at the same time, why don't they listen? Why don't they get better already? Why don't they give it up? Well, they don't give it up because the more hurt they are, the more they need to escape. In other words, the addiction wasn't your problem. Your problem was that you had a lot of emotional pain, you didn't know what to do with. So the addiction was really an attempt to solve a problem. So when you say, why do people use substances or why do they engage in addiction in general? It's because they have a problem they don't know what to do with. And if you really understand their addiction, we have to ask, well, what gave you so much emotional pain? And how come you didn't have the internal resources? This is not a judgment, it's simply an inquiry. How come you lacked at some point the internal resources to deal with that pain in a more creative, forward-looking way that would help you resolve the pain rather than to perpetuate it? So really what it was is that the addiction came along to help you solve a problem you had no other solutions for at the time. And that's the case for all addictions. So why do people use? Why do people engage in addictions? Because they have deep emotional problems they don't have the means to resolve on their own. That's why they use. The average medical student, until very recently, has never even heard the word trauma in their education. It doesn't show up. We don't talk about it. We don't talk about its impact on the brain, on the personality, on the emotional life of people, on its impact on people's physical health. It's not a word that we mention. We're traumaphobic. As a fellow doctor said to me, the medical profession is traumaphobic. Psychiatrists these days are trained mostly in this biological model of psychiatry where everything comes down to a biological brain disease. Here, let's give you a pill. The last thing most psychiatrists know how to talk about is actually emotional pain or its origins in human experience. You think they know how to do that, but they don't. They're not trained in it. It's not part of the predominant medical ideology. And, you know, as a physician, I can tell you, we like to think of medical as a science, and it has certainly great scientific achievements to its credit and great scientific insights to buttress its successes. But it's as much as ideology as a science. And ideology has certain hidden assumptions that are hidden from the people that believe in ideology. And so that if something is excluded by your ideology, you just won't see it. And so that you can be talking to somebody about your addiction, and the simple question, what did they do for you? And how come you're in so much emotional pain? Doesn't occur to anybody, you know, trained in a classical manner. No, this is true not just for physicians, it's true for a lot of psychologists as well, who are more interested in solving your problems and getting you to overcome the behavior than in asking, well, okay, where does this behavior come from? And what are you still carrying inside that's making you behave that way? And how can we help you resolve what's inside you? Not just how do we help you change your behavior, but how do we help you change? Now that's what healing is. And that happens inside a person. So it's never a question of anybody curing anybody else, but we can guide people to healing if we ask the right questions.
Okay. So yeah, so Dr. Gabor Mate is worth checking out. Give me a second. And I want to clarify too. So we've identified the like historical trauma that we may not be realized that we came from as Irish Americans or Americans from different backgrounds. But then, you know, then the stuff that we've experienced in our own life, we may be aware of that. But I think it's also really important to understand that trauma is not an event, it's an experience. And it does not have to be a bloody war. It does not have to be a famine. It does not have to be political oppression. It can simply mean having living in a household where people are traumatized in the way that we don't have the ability to talk about our emotions, and that we're taught to keep everything in, or, you know, having parents that have a substance use disorder, because if the person has a substance use disorder, you cannot be emotionally present for your child. The child is very energetically sensitive. And if that lack of connection and bonding isn't there, that can be traumatizing to a child. It does not have to be sexual abuse, does not have to be physical abuse. The psychological, like I came from a really high functioning family, and we had food on the table, the house was clean, I had clothes, everything was normal, but the psychology that came around the fact that my family was utilizing alcohol to manage their mental health problems and their unresolved trauma, most recently too, was from World War II. A lot of people in our community served in the wars because that was one way to get out of this poverty, right? So my most recent trauma in my family lineage was World War II, and I grew up in my grandparents' house. And it's also nobody's fault. It was not my mother's fault that I couldn't connect with her because she was clinically depressed. That was a trauma response she was born with and taught by, and she went through World War II as a young girl. She was in Germany, and that was just her survival technique. And as a mother, I also want to iterate that it's really important that this is not a mother's guilt thing. This isn't about, oh, if the parents did better and the kids would be okay, and then this wouldn't happen. This is just a survival thing. And so the mother's physiology is designed to imprint through the amniotic fluid in the womb on the baby's genes with the information of what the environment the baby is going to be born in, because it's more important for that baby to survive than to thrive. Because if you're not alive, nothing's possible. So, you know, if our mothers are stressed, if we're generationally stressed, and this information is coming through to the unborn baby, it's a very loving thing for the mother to program that unborn baby into a state of survival and defense when they're born so that they can survive. And that's how this kind of gets passed on through generations. And so the trauma is an experience. It's not an event. It can be relatively minor, and it's also nobody's fault. It's just is what it is. And so, you know, like in this last video, I think the most important thing we can do to break the Irish curse, and how I've done it in my family, is to recognize what's actually going on, have so much self-compassion, have so much understanding that everybody's done their very best. And as a lineage of people, and in my family, we were all forced to go into survival mode, which is incredibly painful. It was natural for us to all reach for alcohol because it soothes that unbelievable pain. And that, of course, there's going to be mental health problems that come along with this. Not only is it the stress, not only is it the stress's impact on the genetic tendencies, it's also the lifestyle that comes along with constantly having to relieve ourselves of pain of being in the moment. So the poor diet, all of the things contribute. And so the way that I found that I've been able to heal myself and really see radical healing in my family is that, first of all, one of us had to come to a deep understanding of what was actually going on. I had to take the first steps to get better. That started with putting down the alcohol and starting to talk about what was going on with me, and then going out and finding solutions, and then coming home and not preaching to anybody, but just showing up better. And when I showed up better, people started to get really curious about what I was doing and start asking me. And that's when the change started to happen, right? And then lastly, I think I just want to close, and I'm so sorry that there's been loss of life in your community, but there is no separation from suicide and alcohol. The two go hand in hand. And I hope from that little video that we just watched, you can see that the alcohol is the medication to the underlying issues that are always there. They are not separate. And unfortunately, the reason that the alcohol, even though it can work so good, ends up being such a detrimental thing is because it affects our gut microbiome so much, because it devastates our liver and our body's ability to detox. The incredible imbalance that it causes in our system, it just perpetuates the depression, it perpetuates the anxiety, it perpetuates all of it, and it makes it worse and worse. And so when you see somebody finally commit suicide, like almost happened to me, and it's happened to many people I care about, it's when the alcohol has stopped working. Oftentimes, or whatever we were using to medicate all of this rather than address it stops working, and then you get to a place where you don't know what to do anymore. And that's oftentimes when people choose to take their own lives. And so the first step with that is to stop drinking. And then you're able to face what's underneath that. And when you can heal that, all of the mental health stuff, all of the addiction stuff, it doesn't really run in our genes. It runs in the way that our family approaches life or doesn't approach life. And then the genes get affected as a result. So you can change that. I think I'm at time. So if you guys have any questions, I'm happy to answer them, or if there's anything else.
Wow, Jen, I just want to say thank you. That was really, really, really powerful. Yeah, I actually didn't know about the potato famine, so I'm really happy I know about that layer to it. Big fan of Gabor Mate and the work, so I'm really excited that you shared, some of that with the community. For those that don't know, I would encourage anybody that has a question now, if you want to unmute yourself and ask it, you can do that. If you're not comfortable, because we are recording, you can always come in to the chat and ask that question. And then after, I'll let you know where you can find Jen and her work and what she's doing and all the good stuff. So I'll pause now and just see if anybody has any questions.
Hi, Megan. Hi, Jen. I just wanted to say thank you. Yeah, that was incredible. You were right, Megan. Or Jen, you were incredible in the stories. Thank you for sharing. I did want to ask if you have if you could pick one or two like good resources for functional medicine, just like a book or a website, something like that. If that could be known. Because I'm rather new at it, but it just rings a lot to me. And I really appreciate the information. It makes absolute sense to me. And then the video links, if it would be possible to share those in the end, or somehow maybe through the chat. But yeah, because the potato famine was really great information, and just in general, how culture can be lost through colonization. It's a really good storyteller in a historic way. So thank you. Yes. That was it.
I'm so glad you're here. So there's not a lot of people doing functional medicine for mental health and addiction recovery yet. I'm one of the few. So I would definitely encourage you to go to my website, which I'll put in the chat. Another great read and somebody to follow is kind of the godfather of functional medicine is Dr. Mark Hyman. And he's got a really great book called The Ultra Mind Solution. That's $18, and it's an entire program to heal your brain, and it's essential. And everything I do in my work is very similar to his, so I'll put that in the chat. Dr. Mark Hyman is just a wizard, and one of the reasons that we have functional medicine today. He is legitimate. Everything he says is true scientifically and well vetted, and he's changing the world. So I can't recommend him more highly. His book is Ultra Solution. You can copy paste this chat if you need to. So I'm going to put that one up first. Dr. Mark Hyman, and he's prolific online, so you can find him really, really easily. I think that another book I would recommend would be 7 Weeks to Sobriety. 7 Weeks to Sobriety. And it's claiming that nutrition is the absolute answer to alcohol use disorder, which I disagree with, but the information as far as nutrition and mental health goes in here is absolutely correct, and it's specific for recovering from alcohol addiction, because alcohol just strips the body of everything, which is why when people try to quit drinking, they have such a hard time. It's because the actual physical effect that alcohol has and the nutrients that it depletes and the damage to the gut. And so you see people struggling to stay sober because they have really bad anxiety, they have really bad depression, and their cravings are through the roof. And so the 7 Weeks to Sobriety, Joan Matthews Larson is the author. She's no longer with us, but her work was because her son committed suicide 6 months sober at age 21. So she went back to school in her 40s and became like a biochemist. Like, she's amazing, and dedicated her entire life to helping to solve this problem. So that's 7 Weeks to Sobriety, Joan Matthews Larson. It walks you through the nutritional early detox. Dr. Mark Hyman's just a more general functional medicine protocol with nutrition and lifestyle to heal your mental health. I also do all this work with people. If you get into the books and it's like, oh my gosh, this is too much. And then let's see about the links to the
And I can also add this in the follow-up email tomorrow
Okay,
too.
cool.
So in case anybody didn't write it down or copy it, then I'll put these resources back in the email tomorrow.
And here's the link to the Irish video that we watched on YouTube. And I would just encourage you to look up Dr. Gabor Mate on YouTube because it's endless, and most of them are an hour or longer, but they're definitely worth watching if that striked a chord with you at all. Dr. Gabor Mate, his main book on addiction is called In the Realm of Hungry Ghosts, and that's a must read if you know anybody that's struggling with substance use disorder. It's much more compassionate and fact-based lens on this dilemma.
Yeah, thank you. I actually, through speaking with Megan Gabor Mate, I was introduced and like open to reading, but also how you say in your healing process, knowledge of trauma and history of family and compassion to self has been such like just trauma in general to me at this point. The imagination recovery is recovering from trauma rather than identifying or giving strength to a substance in particular. Like it's more like opening the heart and mind to experience, to ignoring trauma, I guess. So what I really appreciate about Mate and Carl Hart, somebody I'm into too, is like the compassion and the removing power of language that it seems like our society is so attached to, with also disassociation of humans, like interaction, or like saying, oh no, that I'm not connected to that person. Maybe the video on the Irish and the English experience as well, where the English were disassociating or holding the Irish down, the mental knowledge, just as human and as brilliant people, but took those things away. Anyway, it was wonderful. And thank you.
It's so good to have you here. Yeah, if we understand where we're coming from and why we are the way we are, there's no shame in it anymore. There would be something wrong with us if we were okay after all of that. And it wasn't very long ago, And then the other thing too, like before Ireland was conquered the first time and it became a farming community, we were hunter-gatherers. And so as far as genetics do go, I do give genetic tests that we look at the genes associated with addiction, which there's 12 of them. And the number one that's linked to alcohol use disorder is the DRD2 gene, which is the warrior gene is what they call it. And it's the genes that the hunter-gatherers carry. And what that gene does when it's activated is that it causes us to metabolize dopamine much faster than a normal person. Just like if somebody has a faster metabolism for food and they can eat everything and stay skinny as a rail. So this DRD2 gene, the warrior gene, that's most highly associated with alcoholism, is also the one that was carried by the warriors, the hunter-gatherers. And the reason that it served us in our natural environment was because us metabolizing dopamine quickly, when we're low on dopamine, that's when the cravings come in for the next dopamine hit. What gives us dopamine hits? Drugs, alcohol, winning money, gambling, food, all of these things that are not healthy in our world today, but in the old days when we were still living in our natural environment as hunter-gatherer warriors, because we were worrying for a really long time, that was a trait that would have made us the leader of our clan. That need to get the next dopamine hit would have fired us up and given us the desperation and the courage to go out and get the next hunt and the next kill and defend our villages and all of these things. So these genes aren't even bad things. If I have I have all of these genes, and it's like, oh, it's not a bad thing that we have these genes. It's the fact that they're expressing in a negative way due to the environment. So again, functional medicine, holistic healing. And so I'll never get rid of that DRD2 gene. I metabolize dopamine so fast, but I know how to use it to my advantage now. I know how to do things like get out in nature, take hikes, work on projects, run a successful business, be creative, cook, do all of these things, like literally go out and pick blackberries for an entire day when they're in season, because that's in my nature, right? So going to India on crazy adventures to yoga ashrams high up in the Himalayan mountains, that's giving me my dopamine hits, just like alcohol and risky behavior that almost killed me used to. So when we get to understand how we're wired, we can, change the relationship to our environment and the way that we live our daily life to fulfill our genetic needs in a way that serves us rather than kills us.
Yeah, that's beautiful. I would like to. I would like to learn more. In your ways, like the gene study too. Having that knowledge of history, biological history of yourself, and healing through medicine. Or through food as medicine, is really interesting to me. So that you know in those ways. It would be anyway. I'll definitely reach out because I'm interested in it for sure. Cool.
Yeah, anything I can do to help.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you, Megan.
Thanks for being here. Yeah, I just want to say thanks, Jen, unless anybody else has any questions. If you do, don't be afraid to just kind of hop in. I'm just gonna share, Jen shared her website in the chat, rootsrecoveryclinic.com. I really encourage you to go check it out. She also has a great ebook, cookbook, on really healthy recipes to start the healing process. So if you're curious about that, you can go check it out. It's free. I have it. I downloaded it last year when she offered it. She's going to be doing a 3-month recovery reset program. So I would just go get on her mailing list and get updated. I know she's got so many great offerings, and I'm really grateful, Jen, to you for sharing your time. I know how busy you are. We tried to make the meetings like many times. And honestly, since the moment I decided to have guests on this, I just knew that you had to be one of them. So I'm really happy that it worked out. And for everybody to know, she said yes, like immediately, and just said, if I could help one person, I'm happy to be there. And I do know her schedule is pretty hectic. So I just want to really express gratitude to you, Jen, for being here and sharing all of this with the community. And I will share this recording with your permission, as you said, because I think it's really, really powerful. And I think it's really important. And I know there's many people out there that maybe aren't comfortable, signing up or showing up live yet, and that's okay. So yeah, I just want to say a big thank you for that.
Thank you so much for having me. And thank you for doing this in your community. It's so needed. And for those of you that did show up, thank you. You have no idea how powerful you are. And it just starts with understanding is the first step. So yeah, I used to be afraid if anybody knew I had any problems, and now I speak online to thousands of people, and it's the greatest joy of my life. So everything's possible. And yes, thank you so much for doing all the work that you're doing.
Yeah, and just to remind everybody too, that it really takes a village. I hope that more people start doing this work in the community, and more people start stepping forward and, sharing and doing all these things, because it's not something that any of us can do alone. Like, we really need to be supporting each other and doing it in community and finding different ways to connect with one another that is different than what we're used to. I know, this topic and what Jen shared is not necessarily something easy, but I hope it also empowers you, once you have this kind of information to understand where these things are coming from. That's really the first step. And then you can choose like how you want to move forward. There's endless paths to healing. What works for me won't work for you maybe. And just seek out whatever feels good. And it can start with just like going for a walk in nature. Like, it doesn't have to be this big, profound investment in anything. Like, some of my best tools are free and they don't cost me anything. And we have them at our fingertips with like a pen and paper, you know, breath work, like nature, like there's so many ways to start healing. It doesn't have to be this big ordeal. So I think Jen just planted a great seed for the community, and it's really up to you how you want to move forward. But I do hope it really does empower you guys to know that you can start to change and not focusing on what everybody else is doing, just focus on what you're doing. And as Jen said, that's the best example that you can do. And people may say what they want to say or, you know, not agree, but it really doesn't matter as long as you're following what feels right for you. And yeah, I wish everybody well on that journey. And if we can support in any way, like Jen said, reach out, you know, her website, I'm going to share it with the community tomorrow as well in the email. And you can always reach out to me. I never share who reaches out, and I'm happy many have felt comfortable to reach out. So continue to do that when you feel it's necessary. And I think one of the last points I want to say, because you're also a life coach, Jen, and I think sometimes people don't really know what coaching is. And I think it's really powerful because a lot of it, you know, the traditional ways is about understanding what has happened to us and kind of processing that and accepting it. But coaching can really help you move forward into the person that you really want to become and what you want to be, and taking action steps on how to do that in ways that feel right for you, where you're leading the way and you're really creating your own life the way you want to do it. So just wanted to mention that as well. And that's it. I think I'm 4 minutes over. I said I'm going to honor everybody's time. So keep an eye out for tomorrow's email with all the great resources. And if you're not on the mailing list, I encourage you to sign up so you'll get updated on the next events. And thank you, Jen. As I mentioned many times, everybody that comes on here is a volunteer and is sharing their time and really believes in helping people heal. So thank you, Jen. And thanks everybody for showing up. Bye.
Have a great night. Bye.
Bye. Bye, guys.
Mhm.
Bye, everybody.